Hello and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club Hong Kong online event. My name is Hanna-Miina Tanninen and I am the Vice President for the club. Foreign Correspondents Club Hong Kong, or FCC, is a club for media, creatives and professionals, both international and locals alike, and in my humble opinion, the best press club in the world. We regularly host online discussions, seminars, in-person discussions when the pandemic restrictions allow, as well as photo exhibition, to name a few of our activities. We run community outreach programs and scholarship programs and employ over 100 people. The club was founded 70 years ago, and this year we are celebrating our 40th anniversary on Icehouse Street in a Grade A historic building, which we spend a lot of money, time, and especially love to maintain. To learn more about us, our future online events, and how to join the club, go to our website fcchk.org and find us on social media with the handle @FCCHK. Today, we will discuss the new Europe and whether Finland will join NATO. We have a very special guest today, Professor Alexander Stubb. Arvoisa professori Stubb, suuri kiitos, että olet tullut mukaan meidän verkkoseminaarimme tänään.
Sounds like Chinese to me.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. Let me read your introduction first, and we will then go to the topic of today. So, Professor Alexander Stubb is a former Prime Minister of Finland who currently works as the Director and Professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, which, by the way, does a lot of research on disinformation online and how that forms. Prior to that, he has also served as a member of European Parliament, member of the Parliament of Finland, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Vice President of the European Investment Bank. He holds a PhD in the International Relations Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's regularly interviewed by major media outlets such as Kauppalehti and Talouselämä, Bloomberg, Financial Times, Reuters, to name a few. He speaks 5 languages: Swedish, Finnish, English, French, and German, and he really speaks them fluently and gives interviews, not just writes them on CV. And he's also a sub 9 hours and 30 minutes Ironman, which is 3.86 kilometers of swimming, over 100 kilometers of bicycle ride, and a marathon. So once again, very much thank you for joining us today, and thank you for taking the time. Where in the world are you at the moment?
I'm actually in Florence, in Via Ghibellina, about 500 meters from Santa Croce, where Machiavelli is buried.
All right. Today we will discuss the new Europe and whether Finland will join NATO. You have served, you've done your whole career with the European institutions and with the European politics. So what made Europe and the West so united, and what does it mean, and what is the overall situation at the moment?
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I know that I have a few of my close friends from Hong Kong online. They're listening. So I have to be careful with what I say because I know I'm going to get immediate feedback. I guess the overall situation, to try to frame it very much from a Western or a European perspective, is to say that, you know, there are a few dates in history that change world politics, or especially European politics. And one was obviously 1914 to 1918, World War I, and the creation of the League of Nations to try to contain belligerent states. The other one was World War II, so 1939 to 1945, after which I would argue that the multilateral world was created in the image of the victors and the West, you know, whether it was the UN Security Council or GATT or the IMF or the World Bank, or in Europe more specifically, the European Union and NATO. And then, of course, the third big sort of turnaround was the end of the Cold War and actually the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1989 to 1991. And I think that 2022 will probably be seen with hindsight as one of these sort of turning moments. I mean, if you ask me how are we looking at it right now from the European perspective, well, I mean, probably not that much different from the way in which, you know, foreign correspondents in Hong Kong look at it. But we are very Eurocentric at the moment, and you know, the way in which I see it is that we are basically creating a new Iron Curtain, where we have on one side Russia, wherever the border will be drawn, and Russia obviously as a totalitarian, authoritarian, and aggressive, and actually fully isolated state from the Western perspective, because we've only seen the beginning of the sanctions so far. And then on the other side, you have somewhere between, you know, 30 to 40 European states who are, for all intents and purposes, liberal democracies, you know, social market economies, believe in freedom, human rights, and fundamental rights, and have various memberships in NATO and the European Union. So, you know, it's obviously, it's a tragic situation, it's a dramatic situation. It's a disruptive situation, but we don't know exactly where this is going to go and where this is going to end.
Yeah. At least often in this part of the world, the comments that I hear about European Union is that it's just you know, countries that argue with each other or cannot agree on anything and speak way too many languages and have to write everything down on hundreds of pages. But within the past month or so, we've seen Europe more united than a long time before, and Europe more united with the United States. Where is this coming from, and what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the starting point is to understand that, you know, the European Union, all 27 member states, plus the Euro countries, of course, we're still, you know, pretty much up on par, their biggest economy in the world, together with the US and I guess China as well. But the problem is that a lot of people still mentally are in this sort of mode of Westphalia, that, you know, believe that nation states are supreme and that transnationality doesn't exist. Whereas a lot of people understand in Europe that when you take out the smokescreen of the bickering between the member states, it's actually one of the biggest powers in the world. Now, the difference here is that it used to be just a regulatory superpower. So whatever we regulated, the rest of the world followed, you know, whether it was China or the United States. Now it's also becoming an actor. You know, we saw that during the financial crisis when you know, the future of the euro was at stake. We saw it during the migration crisis in 2015. You know, we saw it with COVID, and now we're seeing it with Ukraine. Now, I'm a bit of an EU nerd, I admit that, because I, you know, started my studies in the States in 1989 and started focusing early on European affairs and ended up doing a PhD on the subject as well. So I am a little bit subjective, but at the same time, I've never seen the European Union more united. So there's nothing, you know, like an enemy that unites you. I don't think this is long term. So, you know, I always say that the EU advances in 3 stages. First, you have a crisis. Second, you have chaos. And third, you have a suboptimal solution. Well, this crisis was a bit different because there was a crisis, but there was no chaos. And I actually think the solutions that we've done so far are quite optimal. I mean, 5 waves of sanctions. Okay, you can ask, have they been enough? Probably not, but, you know, there's more to come. A total reversal of armament exports. Then also there will be a reversal and disruption in energy policy. Remember that the European Union answered the early letters coming from Sergei Lavrov in unison together. The transatlantic partnership, you know, it hasn't been this strong since the Cold War. So I do think that this was a pivot. And let me finish by saying that, you know, if you're standing in the Kremlin as Putin and you're thinking, okay, what was I trying to achieve? And what did I achieve? You know, he might be having second thoughts. He has achieved a European Ukraine. He has achieved a united Europe. He has achieved a revitalized NATO. He has achieved a revitalized transatlantic partnership. And he has achieved the probability of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So, you know, Putin might have his goals, but I think he's done exactly the opposite of what he's trying to do.
You briefly mentioned the European energy situation, which is predicted to become worse, and this is going to be a very long conversation on different sources of energy and how much everything is going to cost. So at the moment, what is the situation with the European energy, especially the vast amounts of energy that European countries import from Russia?
Okay, so here I think we, to a certain extent, have to take a step back. I think one of the lessons learned from this crisis is that the European Union and Europe more broadly has been quite naive in the sense that it's been dependent on Russian energy or Russian gas and American security. And I think this crisis will, force Europe to think anew. So my take on the ground is to say that the response on Russian energy in Europe depends on where you're coming from. So if you come from a country like Finland, we've diversified our energy portfolio for security and other reasons throughout our history. So if energy supply would be cut off at the snap of a finger from Russia, we could convert to other sources. Give you one example, actually two. One is gas. Only 5 to 7% of our energy portfolio is gas, and all of that actually goes to industry. Now, and it comes from Russia 100% sure, but if it's turned off, we can very quickly convert into nuclear, which we have focused on. Now, I'll take another extreme example, then Germany, which is roughly 40% dependent on Russian gas, and a lot of that goes obviously to industry, but also then to heating and households. But the optimist in me says that disruption is quite often good. And for me, this means two things. One is that I think this will potentially sort of make the energy transition in Europe, what we call the Green Deal, go faster, because we will have to detach ourselves completely from Russian energy. So we're only seeing the beginning in yesterday's fifth package of sanctions with coal. The next one will be oil, and then it'll be finalized with gas. But it has to happen step by step for both price reasons and then for security reasons. The second sort of silver lining in this is that I think everyone will start to understand that energy policy has to be in the domain of the European Union. So France, which is a nuclear power, not in armaments, but using nuclear energy, will actually be providing we'll be providing Germany with electricity. So that means that the whole sort of energy grid in Europe will be looked at more together. So, it's always in these situations, there'll be short-term hits for sure. We'll be using dirtier climate, energy prices will go up, et cetera, et cetera. But in the long term, I think this will just speed up things which at the end of the day should be inevitable anyway. In other words, climate transition and European energy policy.
All right. The West has put a lot of sanctions on Russia and Putin and people close to him at the rate that as journalists struggle to keep up at one point. However, for example, during the Crimea crisis in 2014, when you were Minister of European Affairs and then later that year Prime Minister of Finland, why weren't these sanctions and unity from Europe, why did not happen in 2014, and what is different today?
Yeah, sure. I think we should rewind a little bit. Remember that Russia has violated international law, territorial sovereignty and integrity 3 times in the past 14 years. The first one was the war in Georgia in 2008. At the time, I was foreign minister, chairman of the OSCE, and brokered the peace agreement between Georgia and Russia, together with Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner of France. And then, of course, as always, Sarkozy came and took all the glory. But, that's what it is when you have a French president. But that's beside the point. Did we react tough enough then? No, we didn't. We created 2 frozen conflicts, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. but we didn't sort of go tough enough on the sanctions, and the reason was this interplay between realism and idealism. Sort of idealism in the sense that we still believe that Russia would become an integral part of the West and abide by the international rules and security structures. So that's why we wanted to cooperate. And realistically, you know, the pressure wasn't big enough at the time to decouple Russian energy exports from Europe. The second one was the one that you mentioned, then the Crimean Peninsula. Did we go far enough? The answer, again, with the wisdom of hindsight, is to say no. And a lot of it had to do with special interest. Remember, I mean, at the time, the French were about to sell a big, what do you call it? The Fregatta, sort of a big ship that can take planes. And I remember, you know, discussing it with then President Hollande, and it was quite a complicated situation with France. And of course, then Germany, you know, they were still pushing ahead with Nord Stream 2. Finland was saying that Nord Stream 2 is just an environmental issue, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, we didn't go far enough either. There were sanctions, yeah, but not far enough. Now, the difference here is that I think the attack of Putin on Ukraine has just been so violent and blatant and aggressive and vulgar that it has hit and struck a chord in Europe and brought back these memories, not only of the war in Yugoslavia, but even of World War II. And I think a lot of people, including myself, believe that the script of Putin would be the same that he had in 2008 and 2014. In other words, move troops, do trainings, try to intimidate, make territorial claims, declare the independence of the territories, try to get the other side to react. Failing that, you go in with peacekeeping troops and declare the two independent areas, even though no one else does it. And that creates a frozen conflict. But obviously, Putin had a different plan. The Americans were right, the Europeans were wrong. The intelligence of the Americans showed that Putin was going to go all the way, and he did. So he didn't stop with frozen conflicts. And once we started to see the bombing and the shelling, and once the conflict wasn't over in 48 hours, as Putin expected, and we're now in our 6th or 7th week, you know, this is not going to stop. So this is what I'm saying, that this is different. And you know, I think you need to understand that the end game here is full, total, and utter isolation of Russia and of Putin. This means economy, finance, energy, sports, culture, you know, transport, free movement, everything. So Russia will become like a big North Korea, then supported by whoever. But this is what we're looking at in the near future. So don't even believe for 1 second that this is going to stop here. Now that we're starting to see also the sort of atrocious killing of civilians and innocent women, children, and men, like we saw in Bucha. And we're starting to see, you know, mobile crematoria, etc. You have to understand that in Europe, all of Europe, most of Europe is behind Zelensky and Ukraine at the moment, and that puts pressure on then European leaders to react very adamantly.
All right. So then let's discuss whether Finland will join NATO. But before that, very brief question. According to your Wikipedia page, your military rank is Lance Corporal. First of all, is this fact checked? Because I couldn't find a reliable source for this. And why is that? Why do you have a military rank?
Yeah, I think that is factual, but you know, like my marathon time is not, it's too slow there in Wikipedia, someone told me, but you know, I don't meddle with Wikipedia. It says what it says. Yeah, I mean, Finland has compulsory military service. We've always had it. And you know, the way in which I put it is that on one hand, you know, when you have 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia, on one hand, you need to be an idealist and try to trade and get along. On the other hand, you always have to prepare for the worst. So even when the Cold War ended, we kept our military expenditure hovering around 2%. We ended up buying over 60 F-18s. Now we just bought another 64 F-35s. We have a very NATO compatible military. We do training with NATO. Our reserves sit at 900,000 at the moment, so we can mobilize 900,000 men and women. If we were to mobilize, we can get within 4 or 5 days 280 to 300,000 men and women. The reason I'm only a lance corporal is that I had to go to the United States and study, and I didn't want to miss out on another year. So that's why I only did 8 months. And then my sort of promotion actually happened almost tongue in cheek. Our defense minister, when I was foreign minister, our defense minister looked that I was just gun fodder, who said, Alex, we'll make you a lance corporal. And then the president approved it. And this was a bit of a standing joke in the Finnish media at the time as well. But I must say that I'm in better shape than most of our soldiers. I can tell you that.
But overall, should someone visit Finland, a lot of the men and women you see are also highly trained in military, even though they are civilians, and you do not want to mess with the people who check your passports at the Helsinki airport.
Right.
Right. So before we start discussing whether Finland will join NATO or not, I have a little background information for everyone who is not familiar with the process of the decision behind Finland. And I feel like my entire life as a Finnish politics nerd has been preparing me for this moment. So the decision whether Finland will leave the application or not, as based on the information at the moment, will be done by the 200 members of the Parliament of Finland. And mainly that is because the popular opinion has significantly shifted in the favor of NATO, but I'll let that analysis for you. The party that Professor Stubb is representing is National Coalition, which has always been openly supportive for joining the NATO and remains so. Unfortunately, that party is currently in the opposition. So at the moment, the two biggest parties at the Parliament of Finland in power are the Social Democrats and the Centre Party, that have been more opposing NATO than in favor of NATO. The Social Democrats are led by the Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin, who is the youngest female Prime Minister in the world. And the other parties in her cabinet are also led by women, as many of you have learned from the international media. A lot of things come down to how well the young female politicians can convince the older generation of their parties that at the moment it is time to join NATO. But at least personally, if there's someone who can get it done, is a bunch of determined Finnish women. But there are many other factors too. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, the popular opinion in Finland has switched very strongly towards NATO. So why is that, and what the West did differently for the Finland to even start considering NATO within weeks, basically?
Yeah, no, I think that was a very good sort of roundabout of what's going on. If I rewind a little bit, people should understand that during the Cold War, and especially after a rather complicated peace that we forged with the Soviets after World War II, our room for maneuver, our space for sovereign decisions into international institutions was quite limited. So for instance, in the early 1970s, Denmark and Sweden joined EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, but we couldn't do it because of Soviet opposition. So we forged a separate Fin-EFTA agreement. Same thing, the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, which mainly deals with human rights and others. We were not able to join until the 1980s. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, we were very quick in filing an application for EU membership. For us, it was a security political decision. For Sweden, it was more of an economic decision, if you will. In my mind, and I have a track record on this, I think we should have joined at the same time. We should have joined NATO at the same time. But and I wasn't in politics at the time. I was in civil service at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Finland. But in a democracy, it's very difficult for a small minority to push its position over a large majority. So more or less for the past 30 years, the opinion polls have been such that 50% of the population is against the NATO membership, and then 20% in favor. Now, this turned overnight, basically on the 24th of February. Now we're up to over 60% of the population in favor and roughly 15 to 20 against. And once the president and the prime minister come out and say that they're in favor as well, which they're eventually going to do once the process is clear, I predict that we'll have about 80% of the population in favor of NATO membership. I mean, part of it has been this sort of, idealism that we can get along with Russia, but part of it, the sort of anti-NATO sentiment, has been ideological and also, I think, rooted in propaganda that we saw during the Cold War, that NATO is bad. But when our defense ministry, our military, realized in the 1990s that a NATO membership is not in the cards, they started to cooperate very closely with NATO. So we're partners with NATO, we do exercises, and actually we participated in most NATO operations, crisis management, like for instance, Afghanistan. Now, you asked the question, will Finland join NATO? The answer is yes, it will. I'm very convinced of that. And the process is such that there's now, for those who are nerds, there's now a white paper that is being prepared by the government and the president. That's about the security situation. Most probably next week or the week after, that'll be put to the Foreign Affairs Committee and Defense Committee in Parliament. And then separate from that, they have established a parliamentary committee led by the Speaker of the House, former Prime Minister as well, Matti Vanhanen, and then party chairman and group chairman from Parliament. They will then recommend to the political leadership that we should join NATO. And this will happen probably, I'd say, early May. And from that second on, the president, who has the prerogative on this and will send in the application, will do it together with the government. And my prediction is that in the month of May, Finland will apply for NATO membership. In the meanwhile, we've done a lot of work to make sure that we have, if not direct interim security guarantees, at least help if needed. It's also very important to understand that the minute that we apply, Russia will generate this sort of hybrid warfare, intimidation in various types of forms. Final point on this: why did Finnish public opinion change? Because Finns are rational, and they are now driven by rational fear. What if a similar thing would happen to us that is happening in Ukraine? We never want to be left alone again, as we were in the Winter War and the War of Continuation during World War II. That's why we'll apply for NATO membership. I'm of course very pleased, but for me this has been a self-evident thing, because NATO is just the final step in our integration to a value-based democratic defense alliance where we belong from the beginning anyway.
There has been kind of like a running joke that if Finland is NATO compatible and Finland is NATO ready, that even before the current crisis in the Ukraine, if Finland applied by Tuesday, then they could get in by Wednesday noon, which, again, a running joke. Obviously, it doesn't happen that way. So even though we would have had the chance to start the process much earlier, what has the other NATO countries or US or the bigger countries done differently this time that the Finnish public and politicians are in favor of NATO?
Yeah, you need to prepare it. It's not one of these things that overnight on the 24th of February you decide, hey, I think that the Russians are pretty aggressive, time for us to join NATO. And then you pick up the phone and say, hey, Jens Stoltenberg, is it okay if we join tomorrow? I mean, the real world doesn't work like that. So what you need to do is basically consult all 30 member states of NATO, make sure that there are no hiccups on the way to membership. And also in the meanwhile, make sure that you have security guarantees. And, without knowing, I would assume that the Finnish political leadership, and by that I mean to say the president, the prime minister, and the foreign minister, they want to make sure that they have their backs covered. And now that public opinion shifted, then opinion in parliament has shifted. So you could say that more or less 7 out of 8 parliamentary parties are in favor of NATO membership. Even 8 out of 8, depends a little bit on how you look at it. So I think, you know, when push comes to shove and the vote takes place in Parliament, we're talking about way over 150 out of 200 voting in favor of NATO membership. And this is, of course, quite historic, but I think a lot of people then, you know, ask me about Sweden and you know, what's this? You have to understand that, you know, Finland was neutral during the Cold War out of necessity. We had to be. That was the only way we could survive next to the Soviet Union. Whereas Sweden has been neutral because of ideology. So that's why the shift in Sweden is more complicated and slower than what it is in Finland. For us, this is just, you know, normal. Okay, Russia is bad, boom, we go into NATO. Whereas for Sweden, especially for the Social Democrats in Sweden, changing opinion on NATO membership is a little bit like changing religion. And I'm not talking about, you know, moving from, say, Lutheran to Catholic. I'm a Protestant to Catholic. I'm talking about going from Christianity to Islam. I mean, you know, it's just a huge shift, basically. But my guess is that Sweden is actually going to apply pretty much around the same time with Finland. So public opinion has shifted in Sweden. They need to do some groundwork, especially in the Social Democrats. They have elections coming up on the 11th of September. So they'll probably apply, I think, with us. And that will, of course, increase the security in the Baltic Sea region.
All right. Okay. Now we have questions from the audience. You say that like the EU is united against Russia, but Hungary has just re-elected a notoriously pro-Putin leader who undermines the sanctions by buying Russian gas. Do you feel this merits Hungary's removal from the EU? And if not, how do you think EU should handle members that undermine the EU unity against Russia?
Yeah, no, it's a fair enough and a good enough question. I mean, obviously, I've met Viktor Orban quite a few times, and if I may lighten the atmosphere a little bit, if you ask him, Viktor, how are you doing? He usually says, oh, probably better than I deserve. So that's his sort of, you know, approach to life. Now, remember that Orban has been there for 12 years, and we've dealt with him. Now he's going to be there probably for another 4. You know, I think he's basically trying to hold a few things hostage here. You know, number one, he's not very happy with the fact that the European Commission and the member states are probing into his notion of rule of law, media freedom, etc., etc. Number two, he wants to make sure that they start dispersing money from the so-called Next Generation Europe financial package, which was agreed a few months after COVID hit. And then number three, he wants to make sure that all the sort of regional subsidies that he wants, you know, we get. So that's why he's going to, you know, play the game here a little bit. You know, at the end of the day, I don't think he's going to be able, nor will he want to block anything that is linked to sanctions, but he wants to make some noise. Can we kick Orban out? Well, no, not really. I mean, the European Union doesn't work like that. You know, I understand that in the public discourse and in media, there's always this sort of enormous hype about different crises and juxtaposition. And, you know, do I like what Orban is doing? You know, no, I don't. When I was running for lead candidate to become Commission President, I was anti-Orban. That probably, you know, was one part of why I didn't make it through the first round. But you know, the bottom line is that you always have to deal with problem cases as well. And it's funny how things change. I mean, you look at Poland. Poland was treated in a similar way as Hungary, but now that the war started, Poland is like the big hero state, right? You know, there are 4.5 million refugees. I don't know how many of them are in Poland. You know, they've been very adamant against Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, these things change. So, you know, there will be some noise about Orban, but, you know, when push comes to shove, he'll fall into line.
Right. And then we have another question that Currently, the European Union has 27 member states. Is there a scenario where we could have more EU countries in this decade?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it's one of those things. I've always said that probably the most successful policy of the European Union is enlargement. In other words, it functions as a magnet. I mean, everyone wants to join. Well, okay, the UK left, but we've seen what that has what that has caused. And I guess if you're a big state, you have a little bit more leeway of doing that. But staying away from Brexit, the Western Balkans want to join. Turkey wants to join. That's a bit complicated with Erdogan, but deals can be done in various ways. Georgia has filed for membership. Ukraine has done so. Moldova has done so. Will this eventually lead to Swiss membership, Norwegian membership, or Icelandic membership? I don't know, but I do think that we will have more member states coming into the European Union before the end of the decade. I mean, one of the things I am worried about is actually Bosnia, because Bosnia in many ways it's in a complicated political situation, has been ever since the war in Yugoslavia, and we don't know what's going to happen there. But I do think that, yes, the European Union is going to enlarge, or at least we're going to have to start thinking about enlargement more strategically.
You mentioned that Ukraine has applied for membership. How realistic is that within the next, well, obviously not this year, but within the next 5-6 years? And what kind of things the different European countries will consider in their member application?
Well, I mean, I think we need to move probably away from staring blindly at what is called the acquis communautaire. So that's the plus 100,000 pages of European secondary legislation, and think about it more strategically. Now, I don't know eventually what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, but there's certainly been a big shift in the sense that only a few years back, we weren't even talking about Ukraine as a possible candidate. We were just acknowledging their aspirations of being European. Well, now we all know that Ukraine will never be Russian again. So eventually, if and when it wants to join, that's going to have to be taken into consideration. But I'm not going to start giving you, any dates at this stage. Remember also the magnitude of the situation. I mean, Putin has not only killed innocent civilians and soldiers, but he has destroyed cities, he's destroyed infrastructure, and Ukraine needs to be built again, if you will. So we're going to have some kind of a Marshall aid package coming from Ukraine, and how that then leads to path dependency and possible ways of coming into the European Union, I don't know. But that's why I keep on warning people that you have to understand that right now Europe is united, and that's great. It feels good. We have solidarity. We send money. We send arms, et cetera, et cetera. But there will be a time when public opinion shifts, and that's natural. And the shift happens when people start looking inward. So inflation, energy prices, food prices, refugees. So all of those people who think that, okay, now we have wiped the Putinists off the face of the earth, that right-wing populism or left-wing populism, for that matter, is not there anymore. I think they're in for a surprise, because this pack might come back with a force once people start to realize that there's a serious cost of peace or a price of war. And I think the sooner European leaders start communicating that this war means a reduction in your welfare. It means an increase in your heating, electricity, food, and petrol, I think the better, because otherwise we're going to get another wave of populism in all kinds of different ways.
Right. Then we have another question from the audience. You call for full economic isolation with Russia. Do you believe that should include secondary sanctions on countries that refuse to condemn Russia? Whichever those countries then might be.
Is this one of these leading questions?
Yeah, it seems to be, but
no, okay, I'll give you my 2 cents.
Yeah.
You see, I keep on saying this, that, you know, we in Europe and the US, we need to understand that this conflict is not only a conflict about Russia versus the West. It is as much a rejigging of power relations with the West and the rest. And then the question is, you know, where do people pivot? And let me give two answers on this. There was a lot of jubilation about the vote in the UN, right? You had 141 states condemning Russia, 35 abstaining, and 4, you know, pariah states supporting Russia. You know, Eritrea, Syria, Belarus, and North Korea. I mean, the best buddies that you can have in town, right? Now, it's great to say that if you look at it purely in terms of votes in the UN, United Nations. But if you look at populations, it's a bit more complicated, because half of the world's population basically abstain. And there's a reason for this. There is still this sentiment that the world was created in the image of the West and the victors of World War II, as I mentioned earlier. So all the multilateral institutions that we have, they reflect that power structure from the post-1945 world. And that's a world that doesn't exist anymore. So there's this sort of, you know, a message to the West that understand that, yeah, you know, we think this is a horrible war, but, you know, who the hell are you, former colonialist powers, the cause of World War I and World War II, come to tell us on how we should behave? Now, I believe in a dignified foreign policy and also in a value-based foreign policy. But what I think that the West has to understand in the future, that the world is not anymore going to be created in its image. Yeah, I believe that the combination of liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization, combined with freedom, human rights, and fundamental rights, is by far the most successful recipe for society. But not everyone is going to go there. I mean, you guys live that every day. So I think, and then you come to my second point. You probably implicitly want to ask, okay, what's China going to do with this? Well, I put a little Twitter feed on China. And here my argument is that China has, you know, 3 options. One, it pivots or leans towards Russia. The other one, it leans towards the West. And the third one is that it sort of balances or oscillates between the two. And I think it'll end up oscillating. With Russia, it will obviously try to get as much, how would I say, business and influence in Russia as possible. Remember, 30 years ago, Russian, Chinese economies were the same size. Now, China is over 10 times bigger. So Russia, you know, China doesn't need Russia, but Russia needs China. But there will be a price for Russia to pay. And I'll be very frank with you, you know, it'll be a vassal state. Russia will be a vassal state of China. Now, with the West, it wants to avoid the secondary sanctions. And the reason is very simple. I think, roughly speaking, Chinese-Russian business is about 75 billion per annum. European, and Chinese is about 850 billion. So you see the difference in scale. On top of that, when it comes to value chain, whether it's semiconductors or whatever, it's very complicated for China to detach itself. And all these people who believe in this sort of, you know, friendship without limits, I think it's rubbish. You know, so part of my language, you know, sort of undiplomatic language here, but, you know, China still remembers 1969. And China also cares about reputation. And China does not want to be seen as sort of a super supporter of Russia. Having said that, I don't think President Xi Jinping really wanted this war. It's a bit of a nuisance for him, in the sense that he is now focused on trying to deal with zero COVID policy. Good luck. You know, try to contain a virus. It ain't gonna happen. It's gonna explode like it has in the rest of the world. Sorry. And secondly, he wants to focus on the party congress in October, November. But having said that, he doesn't mind that there's a little bit of, you know, mayhem in Europe, and there's a war, because for him, it's also a way of showing that, well, democracy is not a stable form of governance. But, and I'll finish off with this, he doesn't want Putin to lose, you know. He doesn't care. Putin doesn't need to win big, but he can't lose either. So it's a really difficult balancing act. India is the one that I'm worried about as well here, and especially the fact that it hasn't condemned, for instance, the innocent slaughter of civilians in Bucha as well. But this is just, what I'm trying to say is that, the idealist, the one in me says, I want a liberal world order, but it ain't happening. There's also going to be an authoritarian world order, and there's going to be a third world order where, countries hover somewhere in between.
All right. Let me see. Okay, we have still a bit more time left, so I'll see if we get more questions. But before that, is there any kind of topic or point, or your famous 3 points on anything we've discussed that haven't been covered by the questions?
Well, I think one of the things that people need to start thinking about seriously is the world order, right? And I'm trying to sort of get my mind around it. So there are these people who say that we're entering an era of great fragmentation, could well be, or that we are entering an era of deglobalization. I don't believe in that. I believe that we're probably entering an era of the regionalization of globalization. So that's why, the European Union will be a bit of its own bubble. Perhaps Asia, ASEAN will be a little bit of a bubble. Africa will be a little bit of a bubble. Now, I also like the thesis of Mark Leonard, my good friend and president of the European Council for Foreign Relations. He wrote a book not only on China in 2008, but also on what he calls an era of unpeace. And I sort of believe in that sentiment, because today the line between war and peace has been blurred. And of course, right now we're in the middle of conventional warfare. But once that is over, it doesn't mean that we are in an era of peace. It means that everything will in the future be weaponized. So you can use energy as a weapon, as we've seen with Russia at the moment. You can use technology as a weapon. You can use information as a weapon. And to be honest, the European Union is using sanctions as a weapon. So we're going to enter this war where conflict is sort of constant, if you will. And the question is, how can we contain that? And I think that's very important to think about, because, even during World War I, there were groups of people, whatever, think tanks, universities, even politicians, that were thinking about the future world order. And the same thing during World War II, there were people to think about, okay, what happens after the war? And we need to do the same. And here in Europe, we have a lot of people who tell me that, Alex, you can't be that open to changing the world order or the security structure in Europe. I say, okay, fine. What's the solution then? I think, we need to somehow we need to understand that you cannot forcefully export liberal democracy. It has to happen by way of example, right? I think eventually, the human mind is such that things will happen, but in the interim period, you can't shut things out. I'm of course contradicting myself now, because I've said that Putin and Russia should be completely isolated. Yeah, in the short term, they should.
Yeah. When we were discussing the Finland joining NATO, and then you said there's going to be at least a cyber attack or some kind of that. So what is an important thing to keep in mind everywhere in the world using, let's say, disinformation as a weapon, or weaponizing those things, and what kind of things we should prepare for?
Well, we should prepare for everything in a sense. We actually, as you mentioned, here at the European University Institute, we have something called EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory. It's a European Commission-sponsored center that we host with a whole bunch of hubs in different European capitals. And what they try to do is they deal with fact-checking, and then they fight disinformation and try to improve people's, media literacy. And of course, during the war, it's been interesting to see how quickly we react to different types of news without fact checking whether there is a real source behind that news. And it's very easy to get into this sort of spinning of disinformation floating around. And I also say this in the sense that, we're entering a world of deep fakes, where you can have videos that portray something which is simply not true. And people have been whatever photoshopped, and you can make them into really good quality, destroy reputations, or even ignite wars or escalation very quickly. So we have to be very vigilant with this, because of course in a democratic society, if you can't even agree on the basic facts and you live in this sort of virtual world of disinformation, it's very difficult. And here I'm not even talking about a meta world or virtual realities in which we will start living at an increasing pace. So it's going to be a complicated sort of truth to be navigating through, and it is very important. I also warn against when we look at data, right? So there are three ways to deal with data. In China, I'm simplifying, it's centralized and with the state. In the US, it's decentralized and it's with companies, I'm simplifying. And in Europe, it's decentralized and it's with individuals. Because, data is mined from the minute that we wake up. I have my little, this is not product placement, but this is an Aura ring from Finland that measures the quality of my sleep and rest. And that is immediately downloaded into an app. And then I go running and that's downloaded into an app. And then I go to the fridge and people will know what I have eaten. And so what I'm saying is that data is also extremely important part of all of this, and the way in which you fake and control data is going to be part of this bigger discourse, I think.
All right. We have one more question. You mentioned the sacrifices that people will have to make due to inflation and energy shortages. However, both EU and US politicians have been determined to minimize this, such as subsidizing fuel prices, which is likely to worsen the inflation. How can a responsible elected politician navigate such issues, especially when facing populist challenges to their office? That is a great question, by the way.
I was in government only for 8 years, so I wouldn't. But I mean, it's this sort of eternal dilemma that Jean-Claude Juncker used to talk about. We all know what to do, but we don't know how to do it and get re-elected. And that's one of the, I guess, paradoxes of democratic politics. I've always felt that it's quite good to be straightforward and true and not to promise too much to people. And it's got its downsides and it's got its upsides. You end up being a rather unpleasant politician who says that, no, sorry, I'm going to have to cut on schools. No, sorry, I'm going to have to cut on roads. And sorry, I'm not going to increase your social benefits. It's much nicer to be able to give. The problem that we have at the moment is that we've sort of had this double whammy, if you will, or even a triple whammy. The first one was the financial crisis, which became a euro crisis on this side of the continent. Then after that, we had COVID, and now we have the war. So everything in the euro crisis, it was all about austerity versus jobs. It was all about North versus South. But when COVID came, we sort of dropped the gloves and said, listen, this is no one's fault. So we can go ahead and, pump as much money into the system as possible. And don't worry if you do not stick to the more traditional criteria of financial management in terms of debt to GDP ratios or in terms of budget deficits. And now, of course, with the war, it gets even worse. And the whole notion of how we handle financial instruments are changing. And the question is, are we going to at some stage face mega disruption of this or not? I really don't know. But I think that's more of a universal problem as well. I mean, in China or in India or in the US or in Europe. So not an easy one. That's why I always say, and I'm quite open about this. It's a hell of a lot easier to give a little bit analysis as a professor from the sidelines than to take those decisions. It's also very easy, if I may, and the important task of a journalist to criticize politicians because the responsibility is only to freedom of speech, which is great. But at the end of the day, it's not your job that's in line, whereas with politicians, it is. And I think the fallacy or the problem that we might have with democratic politics in the future is that you don't get sensible people going into politics anymore because the upsides are so small. You basically get slammed from morning to night, you lose your reputation, and especially if you take difficult decisions. But that's the beauty of democracy. You're allowed to do that, and then the cycle continues, and you vote the bad guys out and get new bad guys in.
All right, we've been talking for almost an hour about war in Ukraine, different power politics on democracy, increasing energy bills. But in one of your answers, you said something very important, and I would like to finish with that, is that it is important that we keep kind of hope on that, things will be worth it, and things will turn better. So what are the things that we all should keep in mind when these uncertain times will continue in the future, and why we should keep our hope?
Yeah, I mean, I quite often say that we human beings do three things. We over-rationalize the past. So we look at examples from the past, as I did today, from World War II, or the Cold War. Secondly, we over-dramatize the present. We believe that this is a unique moment in history. Now, of course, a war is never good, but the truth is that even when there's not war, we have a tendency to over-dramatize the situation. It's basic nature. But when we do these two things, over-rationalize and over-dramatize, we actually underestimate the future. I still think that the mega trend of mankind is, without being too sort of Yuval Harari-esque, is a good one. People die less of wars, people die less of disease, and people die less of famine, and the development of the world and human beings is tremendous. And I think that at the end of the day, good will win over evil, and that's what we will see in the war in Ukraine as well. Russia will not win this war, right? The cost of it is going to be horrific, and this is once again going to be a reminder of the alternative cost of conventional warfare, which is simply not worth it. Russia, I used to have a history professor who said that Russia is always about 20 years behind the West. Well, now it goes, 30, 40, even 50 years behind the West, back to the Soviet era, being completely isolated. And I think there's hope. There's hope for liberal democracy. There's hope for social market economy. There's hope for globalization. So, the sort of cycle of life and the cycle of the globe continues. And I think also, even though there's been a reversal in technology being used to control, at the end of the day, it can also liberate.
Right. Professor Stubb, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today on very, very important topics. And thank you everyone online for joining the Foreign Correspondents Club Hong Kong event. We will finish our event, but do take a look at our website of our future events. Thank you very much, everyone.